Welcome to Your Week with St. Luke's, a weekly podcast from St. Luke's United Methodist Church in Orlando that invites you to go deeper with Scripture, to learn God's story, so that together we can live, love, and lead a life following Jesus to awaken disciples and reveal the kingdom. This week on Your Week with St. Luke's, we are once more guided by Dr. Ryan Bonfiglio of the Candler Foundry as we conclude our series, Resolute in Purpose, centered on the book of Daniel. We'll be looking at Daniel chapters 5 and 6, the chapters that you have all been waiting for, because this is where we find the best known story from this text, the story of Daniel in the lion's den. And our final question in this series is, how will I lead? Asking us to consider what it means to not only stand resolute in our values for ourselves, but to consider our opportunities to lead others and to lead in ways that deeply impact others. So let's jump right in again with Dr. Bonfiglio one last time for this series.
Thus far in our series, we have made our way through chapters 1 through 4 of the book of Daniel, exploring themes related to the questions of what it looks like to live by faith in a foreign land. All the drama so far has played out in the court of King Nebuchadnezzar. He is on the throne when the Babylonians capture Jerusalem and destroy the temple in 587, and he continues on the throne for the first 25 years of Israel's exile in Babylonia. But as we arrive at chapter 5, Nebuchadnezzar drops out of the story. Instead, we are introduced to a king named Belshazzar. Now, Nebuchadnezzar is said to be the father of Belshazzar, but curiously, we know from Babylonian records that Belshazzar's father actually is another king, a king named Nabonidus, who rules Babylonia from 555 down through 539 BCE. This might be another one of those places where the author of Daniel has his wires crossed when it comes to the chronology of ancient Babylonian kings. In either case, the important thing to notice is that a good bit of time has transpired between chapters 1 through 4 and chapter 5. If Daniel was a teenager at the beginning of the exile in 587, then during the time of Belshazzar, he is at least 50 years old, maybe older. And at this point, he no longer would have been serving in the court of the king. This is a key detail for understanding how the rest of the story plays out. As chapter 5 begins, we learn that Belshazzar is throwing a huge blowout party, inviting 1,000 of his lords and nobles and best friends. And there is drinking, and I mean a lot of drinking in Daniel chapter 5. However, what would have disturbed the original reader was not the amount of alcohol consumed, but rather the cups used to serve the alcohol. You see, Belshazzar had the audacity to use gold and silver cups that Nebuchadnezzar had stolen from the Jerusalem temple to serve his alcohol. It would be like someone today using the church's baptismal font as a large punch bowl. The king was essentially thumbing his nose at the Jews, using for the most common purposes their most sacred objects. Now, in the midst of the king's revelry, the fingers of a hand appear and they begin writing on the wall of the palace. Rembrandt, the great Dutch artist of the 17th century, captured this scene in a famous piece titled Belshazzar's Feast, which you can see here. In the upper right-hand corner, we see a hand emerging from what looks like a dark cloud. And further to the right, we see the so-called writing on the wall. Seeing this message appear, the king is terrified, and he calls for his scribes to help him read the writing. But they can't understand it either. This detail should strike us as odd. Even if the king himself was not literate, there's every reason to believe that his court officials would have been able to read the Aramaic text, as it was beginning to emerge as the lingua franca of the day. So why can't the scribes make sense of the writing on the wall? Well, Rembrandt's painting offers one possible answer. Aramaic, much like its closely related cousin, Hebrew, reads from right to left. And upon first glance, it looks like the writing on the wall in this painting consists of 3 lines of text, each reading from right to left. But upon closer inspection, if you try to read the text in Rembrandt's painting from right to left, it's complete gibberish. However, if you read the text from top to bottom, bottom, it all makes sense. Perhaps Belshazzar's officials failed to notice this, and that's why they could not make sense of the letter. Now, in either case, the king is on the lookout for someone who can interpret the writing for him. Enter the queen. She reminds the king of this guy named Daniel, who used to interpret dreams for King Nebuchadnezzar. So the king brings Daniel in, and he reveals that the words on the wall are as follow: Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. Now, each of these words in Aramaic represents a weight, as in the weight of silver or gold. Mene is about 20 ounces, a tekel is about 3 ounces, and a parsin is about 10 ounces. Daniel can not only decipher these words, but he also discerns in them a secondary meaning. You see, mene is related to a verb mana, meaning numbered, and tekel is related to a verb takal, meaning weighted or weighed, and parsin is related to a verb paras, meaning divided. Daniel sees in the secondary meaning of these words a warning from God to King Belshazzar. Namely, Belshazzar's days are numbered, mana. His deeds have been weighed, takal, and found wanting, and as a result, his kingdom will be divided, parat. In point of fact, the Babylonian kingdom would soon be conquered and split up between two groups of people, the Medes and the Persians. By the way, this is why if you say about something that the writing is on the wall, you mean that there are clear signs that a situation is going to become very difficult or unpleasant. More than anywhere else in the book, chapter 5 presents Daniel in the role of a prophet. Remember, in the Old Testament, the job of a prophet wasn't so much to predict the future as it was to address matters of injustice in the here and now. This included challenging kings and delivering warnings to those who took advantage of the poor and marginalized, and who used their wealth and power for destructive purposes. And this is exactly what Daniel does in chapter 5. Even before he deciphers the writing on the wall, he delivers this stinging rebuke to the king. He says, "You have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know. But the God in whose power is your very breath, and to whom you belong, all your ways, you have not honored." Interestingly, up to this point, Daniel has never stood up to a Babylonian king with this much boldness and impertinence. One might wonder why he decides to do so now. What was the difference at this moment? Now, perhaps Belshazzar's use of the temple vessels as beer mugs was a bridge too far. He just had to say something. Or maybe it has to do with Daniel's age. Remember, in chapter 5, Daniel's no longer a teenager trying to navigate his own survival in the court of a foreign king. In the autumn of his years, maybe Daniel has found the courage, resolve, and self-understanding needed to risk challenging the king face to face. We can't know for sure, but I think what this text teaches us is that there are certain times in life that we need to have the courage to speak up. When and in what situations you'll be called to speak up, I don't know. For that, you'll need to cultivate wisdom and connect yourselves to communities who can help you discern when to take risks and how to build resilience. But in all of this, we should keep in mind the words of Howard Thurman, who says, "Do not be silent. There is no limit to the power that may be released through you. For sometimes the silence of decent, God-fearing people does as much to uphold unjust systems as do the outspoken bigotry of the oppressor." Now, before we close, let's turn briefly to chapter 6, the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Since I've already referenced this story in our last session, let me zero in on just a few details. As the story begins, we have jumped forward yet again in history. Now there's a Persian king on the throne, which means we're somewhere in the late 6th century BCE. Daniel at this point would likely have been north of 80 years old. He occupies a position of power in the Persian Empire, which makes the other officials jealous. They set a trap for Daniel. They convince the king to make a decree stating that it is illegal to pray to anyone or any god other than the king for a period of 30 days. Now, Daniel, of course, continues to pray to his God. The king hears of it and at first is reluctant to punish him, knowing of Daniel's stellar reputation over the past number of decades. The officials are having none of this, and they tell the king that once a decree is made, it can never be revoked. Well, this is utter nonsense. The king certainly could have revoked his own decision, but he goes along anyway with the officials, and he has Daniel thrown into the lion's den. This simply goes to show that the king is gullible and easily manipulated by his officials. In either case, we know that Daniel is delivered from the lion's den. When the king sees this, he is astonished, and almost immediately he offers this beautiful prayer of praise. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, for he has saved Daniel from the power of the lion. This doxology is arguably the theological climax of Daniel chapter 1 through 6. By the lips of a foreign king, the power of the God of Israel to save and deliver his people is proclaimed. Here in this text, God uses an unexpected character to model for us what it looks like to bear witness to good news. Friends, we live now in a world in which bad news surrounds us everywhere. News of war and racism, political strife and civil discord, environmental crisis, and the decline of the church. As followers of Jesus, we are not to deny the realities that lie behind the steady stream of bad news that floods our inboxes and social media feeds. And yet, we are also called to be people who dare to shine light on places where hope and justice are breaking through, where transformation and forgiveness and compassion shatter the veil of hate, and where God is making new things possible, even in the midst of the constraints we face. Unfortunately, we can't end here. We also must note a troubling aspect of Daniel 6. Right before this stirring doxology by the Persian king, the king declares that anyone who had accused Daniel earlier in the chapter are to be brought in and thrown into the lion's den. They, their children, and their wives. This reversal of fortunes is a common theme in many martyr legends. The very punishment intended for those who are persecuted now becomes the punishment for the persecutors. We see this also in the book of Esther, where the chief antagonist, Haman, ends up being hung on the very gallows he has made to kill the Jews. We might even hear hints of this in Matthew 25, in which Jesus says that those who have caused great grief and injustice for the vulnerable in this life will face weeping and gnashing of teeth in the life to come. Understandably, many modern readers find this theme disturbing. Does the deliverance of one group necessarily have to result in the destruction of another? Many are asking this question today with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Unquestionably, the Jews have been the victims of atrocious hate and violence throughout their history. And at too many points, the church has been slow to work towards the liberation of our Jewish brothers and sisters. But at the same time, does the deliverance of the Jews require the destruction of Palestinians? This is, of course, a very complicated question. The end of Daniel 6 might imply that the destruction of those who tried to plot Daniel's death would have created greater safety and security for Daniel and his family. In other words, God delivers Daniel not just from the threat of the lion's den, but from the threat posed by those who arranged for him to be placed in the lion's den in the first place. We must admit that elimination of threat is an important element of liberation. But at the same time, we must also be quick to ask, what are its limits? When does the guarantee of safety for one people become a justification for the oppression of another? The Bible provides no easy answer to this question. But what is worth highlighting is the fact that the Bible consistently emphasizes that what is central to God's kingdom and to God's shalom, what is needed for the healing of divides in the world, is not retaliation, but rather reconciliation. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, the Apostle Paul calls each and every one of us to a ministry of reconciliation, in which we return to others the forgiveness and love that we have received from God. Now, this doesn't mean that we turn a blind eye to the realities of injustice and oppression. Far from it. But we must admit that injustice cannot be solved with more injustice. Our pain and grief will not be eased by causing pain and grief to others. Liberty for one cannot mean oppression for others. Our liberation is bound up together. May we be a people who answer this call to reconciliation.